August 25, 1944, Paris stands on the edge of annihilation. Adolf Hitler has given explicit orders. If the City of Light cannot remain in German hands, it must be destroyed. Every bridge over the Seine River is wired with explosives. The Eiffel Tower's supports are packed with dynamite. Notre Dame Cathedral, the Louvre, the Arc de Triomphe, all of France's most precious monuments are rigged to explode. One German general holds the detonator, and he's been ordered to push it. But something extraordinary is about to happen, something that will change this general's mind, something that arrives not in the form of tanks or soldiers, but floating down from the sky on pieces of paper, leaflets. Simple propaganda leaflets printed in black ink on sheet paper. Words that will convince a Nazi general to disobey Hitler's direct order and save one of humanity's greatest cities from total destruction. This isn't just a story about propaganda. This is a story about psychological warfare so precise, so perfectly targeted, that it altered the decision of one man, and in doing so, saved millions of lives and preserved irreplaceable cultural heritage. This is the story of how Allied intelligence decoded the mind of General Dietrich von Choltitz, crafted the perfect message, and delivered it at the exact moment when words became more powerful than explosives. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of the most remarkable propaganda operations of World War II, the leaflet drop that saved Paris. This is the untold story of how psychological operations, intelligence analysis, and mass communication combined to prevent cultural catastrophe, how the Allies weaponized words to fight dynamite, and how understanding one man's psychology saved the most beautiful city in the world. Paris in chains, the occupation. To understand how Paris reached the brink of destruction, we must first understand what the city endured under 4 years of Nazi occupation. When German forces marched into Paris on June 14, 1940, they weren't conquerors arriving to destroy, they were tourists arriving to possess. Hitler himself visited Paris just once, on June 23, 1940, taking a 3-hour tour of the city he'd long admired from afar. He stood before the Eiffel Tower. He visited Napoleon's tomb. He walked through the Opera House, and he decided Paris should remain intact as a jewel of the Third Reich. For 4 years, Paris lived under the swastika. German soldiers strolled the Champs-Élysées. Nazi flags hung from the Eiffel Tower. The occupation government requisitioned hotels, museums, and government buildings. Parisians endured rationing, curfews, surveillance, and the constant presence of their conquerors. Jewish residents were rounded up and deported to concentration camps. Resistance fighters operated in shadows, risking torture and execution. The City of Light became a city of fear. But Paris itself remained physically intact. The Nazis wanted to preserve it, to demonstrate that German culture could appreciate and possess the finest achievements of Western civilization. Hitler even had grandiose plans to make Berlin more beautiful than Paris after the war. For this fantasy to work, Paris needed to survive as a benchmark of beauty to be surpassed. By summer 1944, everything had changed. The Allied invasion at Normandy on June 6, D-Day, succeeded beyond German nightmares. American, British, and Canadian forces pushed inland, liberating French towns and villages. The German army in France was collapsing, retreating toward Germany. Paris, the symbolic heart of occupied France, would soon be encircled. The question wasn't whether the Allies would reach Paris, but what condition they'd find it in. Adolf Hitler, facing defeat across all fronts, grew increasingly irrational and vindictive. He'd ordered scorched earth policies in the Soviet Union, destroy everything before retreating. He demanded the German cities fight to the last building, even as Allied bombers reduced them to rubble. And now, as Paris slipped from his grasp, Hitler made a decision that revealed his descent into madness. If Germany couldn't have Paris, no one could. The city must be destroyed. On August 23, 1944, Hitler sent an explicit order to General Dietrich von Choltitz, the military governor of Paris. Paris must not fall into the enemy's hands, except as a field of ruins. The order was clear. Destroy the bridges. Demolish the monuments. Burn the city. Leave the Allies nothing but ashes and rubble. Make Paris a tomb. General von Choltitz received these orders and began preparations. German engineers wired explosives to every bridge spanning the Seine River, 37 bridges connecting the city's right and left banks. They placed demolition charges at the Eiffel Tower, planning to topple the Iron Landmark. Notre Dame Cathedral, 8 centuries old, was rigged with explosives. The Palais Bourbon, seat of French government, was prepared for destruction. The Luxembourg Palace, the Invalides, major railway stations, all marked for demolition. Von Choltitz had approximately 3,000 tons of explosives distributed throughout Paris. He had the capability to reduce the city to rubble. He had direct orders from Hitler to do exactly that. And the Allied forces were approaching rapidly. The clock was ticking. Within days, perhaps hours, von Choltitz would have to make a decision: obey Hitler and destroy Paris, or disobey and face execution for treason. This was the situation when Allied psychological warfare officers began their most critical operation. They had to stop von Choltitz from pushing the button. They had to change the mind of a Nazi general who'd spent his career following orders without question. And they had to do it using the most unlikely weapon imaginable: paper leaflets dropped from aircraft. The General. Understanding Dietrich von Choltitz. Allied intelligence faced a crucial challenge. Who was Dietrich von Choltitz? What kind of man held Paris's fate in his hands? Could he be persuaded, manipulated, or intimidated into sparing the city? Understanding the target's psychology became the foundation of the entire propaganda operation. Typewriter clacking, intelligence files opening. The intelligence profile that emerged was complex. Von Choltitz was a career military officer, 50 years old, from an old Prussian military family. He'd served in World War I as a young man. Between the wars, he remained in the German army, rising through the ranks based on competence and loyalty. When World War II began, von Choltitz commanded infantry units, fighting in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. His military record was troubling. Von Choltitz had participated in brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front, where German forces conducted war crimes as routine policy. He'd commanded the siege of Sevastopol in Crimea, where the city was bombarded into submission with massive civilian casualties. He'd overseen operations in Ukraine, involving destruction of villages and harsh treatment of civilians. This wasn't a gentle soldier or a secret humanitarian. This was a man who'd followed barbaric orders before. But Allied intelligence also identified crucial details that suggested possible leverage points. Von Choltitz wasn't a fanatical Nazi. He joined the army long before Hitler came to power and maintained traditional Prussian military values rather than Nazi ideology. He wasn't a member of the Nazi Party. He respected military professionalism and honor, concepts that sometimes conflicted with Nazi brutality. More importantly, intelligence reports indicated von Choltitz was intelligent enough to recognize that Germany was losing the war. By August 44, this was obvious to anyone paying attention. The Soviet Union was crushing German armies in the east. The Allies controlled France and were advancing toward Germany. German cities were being bombed into ruins. Hitler's promised wonder weapons and miraculous victories never materialized. Germany's defeat was inevitable. The only question was, how long until surrender? Allied psychological warfare officers, particularly those in the Office of Strategic Services and the Political Warfare Executive, the American and British propaganda agencies, analyzed von Choltitz's situation. They identified several psychological vulnerabilities.
First, self-preservation. If von Choltitz destroyed Paris and the Allies captured him, he'd face trial for war crimes. The destruction of a cultural treasure like Paris would make him one of history's great villains, personally responsible for a catastrophic loss to human civilization. He'd be hanged, certainly, and remembered forever as the man who destroyed Paris. Second, family concerns. Von Choltitz had a wife and children in Germany. If he defied Hitler's orders, the Nazis might execute his family in retaliation, Nazi policy for traitors. But if Germany was about to lose the war anyway, this threat had diminishing power. Would Hitler's collapsing regime have time to track down one general's family before Germany surrendered? Third, legacy and honor. Von Choltitz came from a military tradition that valued honor, even if that tradition had been corrupted by Nazi service. Did he want to be remembered as the destroyer of Paris? Or could he be repositioned as the savior of Paris, the general who chose humanity over fanaticism? Fourth, practical military reality. Von Choltitz commanded a garrison of approximately 20,000 German troops in Paris, facing both approaching Allied armies and an uprising by the French resistance inside the city. The Paris police had gone on strike. Resistance fighters were attacking German positions. The situation was untenable. Destroying the city wouldn't change the military outcome. Germany would still lose. It would only add meaningless destruction to inevitable defeat. These psychological insights became the foundation for the leaflet operation. Allied propaganda experts crafted messages specifically targeting von Choltitz's decision-making process. The leaflets would offer him a choice, framed to make sparing Paris the rational, honorable, self-interested decision. The words on those pieces of paper would be weaponized psychology, designed to exploit every vulnerability Allied intelligence had identified. The weapon: psychological warfare and leaflet campaigns. Propaganda leaflets were among the most widespread weapons of World War II. Billions of leaflets were printed and distributed by all sides, dropped from aircraft over enemy territory, smuggled across front lines, and distributed through resistance networks. But most leaflets had limited impact. Soldiers receiving enemy propaganda typically ignored it or turned it in to their superiors. Civilians dismissed it as lies. The effectiveness of leaflet campaigns was generally low. But this operation was different. This wasn't mass propaganda aimed at broad audiences hoping for small statistical effects. This was precision psychological warfare targeting one specific individual at one critical moment. The leaflets would be crafted for an audience of one: General Dietrich von Choltitz. The Allied Psychological Warfare Division, operating under Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, coordinated the operation. They worked with intelligence from the Office of Strategic Services, which had detailed files on German commanders. They consulted with French intelligence officers who understood Paris and its symbolic importance. And they brought in specialists in German military culture, psychology, and propaganda techniques. The challenge was creating the perfect message. The leaflets couldn't simply order von Choltitz to spare Paris. He'd ignore enemy orders. They couldn't threaten him with war crimes trials. That might provoke him to destroy the city out of defiance or fatalism. They couldn't appeal to mercy or compassion. He demonstrated little of either in previous campaigns. Instead, the psychological warfare experts decided on a multi-pronged approach using several different types of leaflets, each targeting specific psychological vulnerabilities. The first type of leaflet would focus on military futility. These leaflets explained in professional military language that destroying Paris served no strategic purpose. The bridges would be rebuilt, the monuments were militarily irrelevant. Demolishing infrastructure would inconvenience the Allies for perhaps a few weeks, while guaranteeing von Choltitz would be hunted down as a war criminal. From a purely tactical perspective, destruction was irrational. The second type appealed to military honor. These leaflets contrasted the professional German military tradition with Nazi fanaticism. They suggested that true soldiers protected civilians and respected cultural heritage, even in defeat. They invoked the examples of German generals in previous wars who'd spared cities. Destroying Paris would be recognized as the act of a fanatic, not a soldier. The third type focused on self-interest and survival. These leaflets made clear that the war was ending, Germany had lost, and von Choltitz's choices now would determine his fate after the war. Spare Paris, surrender peacefully, and be treated as a prisoner of war. Destroy Paris and face trial and execution as a war criminal. The choice was framed as survival versus suicide. The fourth type of leaflet was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated. These leaflets were designed to appear as if they came from within Germany itself, from German officers or civilians who opposed Hitler's insane orders. They used German military terminology and cultural references that would resonate with a Prussian officer. They suggested that other German commanders were already disobeying suicidal orders, that saving what could be saved was the honorable path, that Germany needed officers who'd survive to rebuild after the war. All of these leaflets were printed on high-quality paper using professional typography. This was intentional. Cheap, crude propaganda looked like propaganda and was easily dismissed. But well-produced materials suggested official military communications or serious political messages. The Allied Psychological Warfare Division wanted the leaflets to look credible, authoritative, and worthy of consideration. The text was crafted in flawless German by native speakers who understood not just the language, but the cultural nuances, military terminology, and psychological frameworks that would resonate with a German general. Every word was chosen for maximum impact. Every argument was structured to lead von Choltitz toward one conclusion. Sparing Paris was the rational, honorable, self-interested decision. The drop. Operation Execution. By August 24, 1944, the situation in Paris was critical. The French resistance had launched an open uprising against the German occupation. Street fighting erupted across the city. German positions came under attack. Von Choltitz's garrison was overwhelmed, fighting battles inside Paris while Allied armies were approaching from outside. The moment for destroying the city was approaching rapidly. Allied psychological warfare aircraft prepared for the leaflet drop. These were typically light bombers or transport aircraft modified to carry and distribute propaganda materials. The aircraft would fly over Paris at night, releasing bundles of leaflets that would flutter down across the city like mechanical snow. The operation required precise timing. Too early and the leaflets would be ignored. Too late and von Choltitz might have already pushed the button. The aircraft took off from Allied-controlled airfields in liberated France. They carried approximately 2 million leaflets specifically targeting von Choltitz and the German garrison in Paris. The flight was dangerous. German anti-aircraft guns still controlled parts of Paris, and Luftwaffe fighters occasionally appeared despite Allied air superiority. But the mission was considered critical enough to justify the risk. On August 24th, the aircraft reached Paris. The city below was partially darkened by blackout restrictions, but fires from the resistance uprising illuminated neighborhoods. German and resistance forces were fighting in the streets. The aircraft flew over central Paris, over the very monuments that were rigged with explosives, and released their payload. 2 million leaflets began falling. They drifted down through the night air, spinning and tumbling, landing on rooftops, streets, parks, and courtyards. They landed in German military compounds. They landed near von Choltitz's headquarters at the Hotel Meurice. They landed in the hands of German soldiers, French civilians, and resistance fighters. The paper storm of psychological warfare had arrived.
The leaflet's content varied, but all carried variations of the same core messages. Paris had no military value worth destroying. The war was lost. Destroying Paris would accomplish nothing except guaranteeing von Choltitz would be hunted as a war criminal. History would judge him based on his choice in this moment. He could be the destroyer or the savior of Paris. Which legacy did he choose? Some leaflets specifically addressed von Choltitz by name and rank, demonstrating that the Allies knew exactly who made the decision and held him personally accountable. This personalization was psychologically important. It wasn't abstract propaganda aimed at the enemy. It was direct communication with one man, acknowledging his power and responsibility. Other leaflets contained testimonies supposedly from German civilians describing the destruction of German cities by Allied bombing, asking why should Paris be destroyed when German cities were already in ruins? The message? Adding more destruction to an already catastrophic war served no one's interest, German or Allied. The most psychologically powerful leaflets included photographs. Images of destroyed German cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, demonstrating the futility of destruction. Images of Paris's monuments with captions asking whether these treasures should be dynamited. And crucially, images suggesting what Paris would look like after destruction, juxtaposed with images of beautiful, intact Paris, forcing von Choltitz to visualize the choice he faced. Within hours, German soldiers throughout Paris had collected the leaflets. Some turned them in to officers. Some read them privately, the words planting seeds of doubt. Some were delivered directly to von Choltitz's headquarters by subordinates. The general couldn't avoid them. The message was inescapable. The world was watching him. History was watching him, and his decision would define his legacy forever. The resistance. Pressure from within. While the leaflet drop represented Allied pressure from outside, von Choltitz faced equally intense pressure from within Paris. The French resistance, knowing that the city's liberation was imminent, had launched a general uprising on August 19th. This wasn't careful guerrilla warfare. This was open revolution. Resistance fighters seized government buildings, attacked German patrols, and raised the tricolor flag over liberated neighborhoods. The Paris police, approximately 20,000 officers, went on strike and joined the resistance. This was crucial because the police knew the city intimately and possessed weapons and organization. They occupied police stations, turned them into resistance strongholds, and coordinated with resistance fighters throughout the city. German forces suddenly found themselves fighting not just hidden partisans, but organized armed units controlling territory within Paris itself. Von Choltitz's military situation deteriorated rapidly. His 20,000 troops were scattered across Paris in garrisons and checkpoints. Resistance attacks forced them to consolidate into defensive positions. German convoys couldn't move through the city without facing ambushes. Communication between units became difficult. The garrison was effectively besieged inside the city they occupied. The French resistance also waged psychological warfare. They spread rumors that Allied forces were just hours from entering Paris. They claimed that Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc were racing toward the city. They published underground newspapers declaring Paris's liberation imminent. This information warfare created a sense of inevitability. The Germans had already lost Paris. The fighting was just formality. Resistance leaders also attempted direct communication with von Choltitz. Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris, who maintained neutral diplomatic status, became an intermediary. Nordling met with von Choltitz multiple times between August 19th and August 25th, negotiating temporary ceasefires and attempting to persuade the general to spare the city. Nordling's approach complemented the leaflet campaign perfectly. While the leaflets provided rational arguments and psychological pressure, Nordling provided personal, human persuasion. He described the suffering of Parisian civilians. He painted vivid pictures of what destruction would mean for millions of innocent people. He appealed to von Choltitz's humanity, whatever remained of it after years of brutal warfare. Nordling also delivered a crucial message. If von Choltitz spared Paris and surrendered peacefully, the Allies would treat him as a prisoner of war rather than a war criminal. This wasn't official Allied policy. Nordling had no authority to make such guarantees, but the promise was psychologically powerful. It offered von Choltitz a way out, a path from destruction to survival. The combination of external pressure from the leaflet campaign and internal pressure from the resistance and Nordling created a psychological vice. Von Choltitz was surrounded by messages from every direction, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Destroying Paris was irrational, immoral, and suicidal. The only path that made sense, militarily, morally, personally, was to disobey Hitler's order.
The decision, August 25, 1944. On August 25, 1944, the moment of decision arrived. Allied forces, particularly the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, entered Paris. Street fighting continued between German forces and the resistance. Von Choltitz's headquarters at the Hotel Meurice was surrounded. The detonators that could destroy the bridges and monuments sat ready. One order from von Choltitz would send Paris up in flames. The general sat in his office, surrounded by reports of military collapse. His garrison was disintegrating. Resistance forces controlled large parts of Paris. Allied tanks were entering the city. The radio brought news of German defeats across every front. Everything was falling apart. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was dying after 12 years, and von Choltitz held the power to add one final catastrophe to Germany's legacy. What was going through his mind? Post-war accounts provide some insight. Von Choltitz later claimed he never seriously intended to destroy Paris, that he recognized Hitler's order as insane from the moment he received it. But this may be self-serving revisionism, rewriting his own hesitation as principled resistance. More likely, von Choltitz wrestled with genuine conflict between duty, fear, rationality, and self-preservation. The leaflets had clearly reached him. German officers later confirmed that von Choltitz read the Allied propaganda extensively. He discussed the arguments with his staff. He considered the consequences spelled out in the leaflets. The psychological warfare operation had penetrated his decision-making process, exactly as intended. Von Choltitz also met again with Ralph Nordling that morning. Nordling made final pleas for the city, appealing to the general's sense of history and humanity. The conversation lasted hours. Nordling painting vivid pictures of destruction versus preservation, damnation versus redemption. The Swedish diplomat became the human voice, delivering the same message the leaflets had dropped from the sky.
At approximately 2:30 p.m. on August 25th, French forces led by Lieutenant Henri Cartier entered the Hotel Meurice. They fought room by room through the building, German soldiers surrendering as they advanced. Finally, they reached von Choltitz's office. The general sat at his desk, apparently calm, waiting. He made no move toward the detonators. He'd made his decision. When Lieutenant Cartier entered, von Choltitz stood and formally surrendered. He handed over his pistol. He identified himself and accepted prisoner of war status. And crucially, he gave orders to his remaining forces to cease fighting and surrender. The battle for Paris was over. The monument stood intact. The bridges remained undetonated. The Eiffel Tower still pointed toward the sky. Paris survived. Why did von Choltitz make this choice? The truth is probably complex, a combination of factors rather than one simple explanation. The military situation was hopeless, making destruction pointless. The leaflet campaign had spelled out consequences clearly, making survival rational. Nordling's personal diplomacy provided human connection to abstract arguments. The resistance uprising demonstrated that Paris's people would fight regardless. And perhaps, somewhere deep in von Choltitz's psychology, some spark of conscience, honor, or human decency influenced his decision. Later that day, General Charles de Gaulle, leader of Free France, entered Paris in triumph. Crowds celebrated in the streets. The nightmare of occupation was ending. And Paris, beautiful, irreplaceable Paris, remained standing because one man, at one critical moment, chose humanity over fanaticism. The leaflets had worked. The psychological warfare operation had succeeded. Words on paper had defeated tons of explosives. The aftermath, consequences, and controversies. The salvation of Paris resonated far beyond that August day. The city's survival meant that millions of civilians weren't killed or displaced. Irreplaceable cultural heritage spanning centuries remained intact. The symbolic heart of France survived to witness liberation and rebuild after the war. But the story of how Paris was saved and von Chaltis's role remained controversial for decades. Immediately after the war, von Chaltis was held as a prisoner of war by the Allies. He wasn't tried for war crimes, despite his involvement in brutal operations on the Eastern Front. This leniency may have been partly because he spared Paris, exactly as the leaflets had suggested might happen. His cooperation and surrender and his decision not to destroy the city seemingly earned him the treatment promised in Allied propaganda. In 1949, von Chaltis published his memoirs titled Burning Paris. The book presented him as a hero who'd always intended to save Paris, portraying his disobedience to Hitler's order as an act of conscience. The memoirs became the basis for a 1966 film, Is Paris Burning?, which further cemented the narrative of von Chaltis as Paris's savior. But historians questioned this self-serving narrative. Evidence suggested von Chaltis had indeed prepared to destroy Paris and only changed his mind when circumstances, military collapse, Allied pressure, and psychological warfare made destruction irrational. The leaflet campaign and Nordling's diplomacy weren't just coincidental background to a principled decision, they were active factors that changed von Chaltis's calculus. Declassified Allied documents confirmed the psychological warfare operations' sophistication and intentionality. The leaflets were specifically designed to target von Chaltis, crafted using intelligence about his personality and situation. Allied psychological warfare officers understood they were attempting to alter one man's decision at one critical moment, and they succeeded. The French resistance also contested the von Chaltis saved Paris narrative. Resistance leaders argued that their uprising, not German mercy, prevented destruction. By forcing German forces to fight for survival inside Paris, the resistance made it impossible for von Chaltis to systematically destroy the city. German engineers trying to detonate bridges would have been shot by resistance fighters. The chaos of street fighting disrupted any organized destruction plan. The truth likely encompasses all these factors. Von Chaltis didn't destroy Paris because of a combination of the leaflet campaign's psychological pressure, Nordling's diplomatic persuasion, the resistance uprising's disruption, the military situation's hopelessness, and perhaps some internal moral calculation. No single factor fully explains his decision, but the leaflet operation was demonstrably significant. From a propaganda and psychological warfare perspective, the operation became a case study in effectiveness. Military and intelligence agencies analyzed how precision psychological operations could achieve strategic effects. The principles learned in Paris, understand the target's psychology, craft messages exploiting specific vulnerabilities, deliver at critical decision points, influenced Cold War psychological operations and modern information warfare. The operation also demonstrated the power of multi-channel psychological pressure. The leaflets alone might not have worked. Nordling's diplomacy alone might have failed. The resistance uprising alone might have provoked destruction out of spite. But combined, these elements created overwhelming psychological force that made sparing Paris the rational choice. The legacy: lessons in psychological warfare. The leaflet drop that saved Paris teaches profound lessons about psychological warfare, propaganda, and the nature of human decision-making under extreme pressure. These lessons remain relevant in modern conflicts, information warfare, and even peacetime persuasion. First, understand that psychological warfare works best when it targets specific individuals at specific moments, rather than broadcasting generic messages to mass audiences. The Paris leaflets succeeded because they were designed for an audience of one, General Dietrich von Chaltis. Every argument, every appeal, every threat was calibrated to his specific psychology, situation, and decision-making framework. Modern information operations often fail because they're too broad, too generic, too unfocused. Second, effective psychological warfare requires excellent intelligence. The Allied psychological warfare officers couldn't have crafted persuasive leaflets without detailed knowledge of von Choltitz's background, personality, values, and situation. Intelligence provided the foundation for psychological operations. Understanding the target's mind enabled manipulating the target's decisions. Third, psychological warfare must offer the target a rational path forward that serves their self-interest. The Paris leaflets didn't just threaten von Choltitz or appeal to compassion. They presented clear reasoning why sparing Paris benefited him personally. Survival, avoiding war crimes prosecution, preserving honor. These were self-interested reasons to disobey Hitler. Effective persuasion aligns the desired behavior with the target's own interests. Fourth, timing is critical in psychological operations. The leaflets were dropped at the exact moment when von Choltitz faced his decision. Earlier, and they might have been forgotten. Later, and the decision might have already been made. The psychological warfare operations succeeded partly because it delivered the right message at the right time. Fifth, multi-channel pressure multiplies effectiveness. The leaflets worked in concert with Nordling's diplomacy, the resistance uprising, military pressure from approaching Allied forces, and the overall trajectory of the war. No single channel alone would have been sufficient, but combined, they created irresistible psychological force that made sparing Paris the rational choice.
Sixth, credibility matters more than volume. 2 million leaflets wouldn't have worked if they'd been crude propaganda. The care taken in crafting professional, credible, well-reasoned arguments made the leaflets persuasive. Quality trumped quantity in psychological impact.
From a broader perspective, the Paris leaflet operation demonstrates that words can indeed be weapons, not metaphorically, but literally. Words that change decisions, alter behavior, and achieve strategic effects that kinetic weapons cannot. The leaflets saved Paris more surely than any military force could have because they changed the mind of the man who controlled Paris's fate. This principle extends beyond military applications. In politics, business, diplomacy, and personal relationships, understanding psychology and crafting persuasive communication can achieve outcomes that force cannot. The Paris operation proves that changing minds is often more effective than changing facts on the ground. Closing. Words that saved a city. So remember this. On August 25, 1944, Paris stood on the brink of destruction. Explosives packed the bridges. Dynamite wired the monuments. One German general held the detonator, and pieces of paper floating down from the sky changed his mind. Not tanks, not soldiers, not bombs. Paper and words. The leaflet drop that saved Paris reminds us that the most powerful weapons aren't always the most obvious. Sometimes understanding psychology matters more than firepower. Sometimes crafting the right message matters more than delivering overwhelming force. Sometimes changing one mind at one critical moment matters more than winning 1,000 battles. General Dietrich von Choltitz wasn't a hero. His military career included participation in war crimes and brutal campaigns. He followed monstrous orders throughout World War II. But at one moment, facing one decision, he chose humanity over fanaticism. And that choice, influenced by psychological warfare, diplomatic persuasion, military pressure, and perhaps some flicker of conscience, saved one of humanity's greatest cities. The leaflets didn't create von Choltitz's conscience. They didn't transform him from villain to hero. But they did something perhaps more remarkable. They gave him rational, self-interested reasons to do the right thing.
They aligned his survival instincts with Paris's survival. They made sparing the city the logical choice for a man thinking about his own future rather than Hitler's delusional orders. This is psychological warfare at its finest. Not crude threats or obvious propaganda, but sophisticated, targeted communication that understands the audience's psychology and exploits it perfectly. The Allied psychological warfare officers who crafted those leaflets understood von Choltitz better than he understood himself. They knew which arguments would resonate. They knew which fears to exploit. They knew how to frame the decision so that only one choice made sense. And so Paris survived. The Eiffel Tower still stands, Notre Dame still rises above the Seine, the Louvre still houses humanity's artistic heritage. Millions of people live in a city that might have been reduced to rubble. All because psychological warfare worked. All because words, delivered at the right moment to the right person, changed history. This was Cipher Tales, decoding the hidden history of World War II propaganda and espionage. The leaflet drop that saved Paris proves that intelligence, creativity, and understanding human psychology can achieve what armies cannot. That words can be weapons. That persuasion can defeat destruction. And that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the strongest force, but from the most insightful communication. If you want to decode more extraordinary secrets from World War II, subscribe to Cipher Tales. Hit that like button if this story of psychological warfare saving Paris amazed you. Comment below and tell us what other propaganda operations should we decode next. The fake invasion of Pas-de-Calais? Radio Tokyo's broadcasts to American troops? The Soviet Union's psychological warfare against Germany? Paris stands today because someone understood that even in war, even facing fanatics, psychology matters. Minds can be changed, decisions can be influenced, and sometimes the right words at the right moment save millions of lives. The leaflets have long since turned to dust, but the city they saved endures. And the lesson remains. Understanding the human mind is the most powerful weapon of all.